today we'll be continuing with post-colonialism, which we started last week with Frantz Fanon, and specifically we'll be thinking about the thought of GAYATRI, CHAKRAVORTY, Spivak. We're going to briefly look at her life. We'll think about how she uses deconstruction on colonialism, and we'll consider what she has to say about the problem of representing different groups, and we'll apply this in the end in the context of a very famous article, Can the Subaltern Speak? So GAYATRI CHAKRAVORTY Spivak was born in 1942 in Calcutta. Her great-grandfather, I think quite interestingly, was actually Sri Ramakrishna's doctor. Sri Ramakrishna is an extremely well-known Hindu philosopher, an Advaita Vedanta philosopher. He's sort of one of the giants of the modern era in that tradition. Spivak attended Presidency College in Kolkata, which is part of the University of Kolkata, and from which she graduated in 1959. She then attended Cornell University from 1961, where she earned her MA in English, paid for with money borrowed on what's called a life mortgage. She couldn't get funding to continue in English, though, and so in 1962 she transferred into the new comparative literature program at Cornell University, and she continued there and ended up getting her PhD in comparative literature, while at the same time teaching at the University of Iowa, and she received tenure there in 1970. Now in 1967 she bought a book by an author she didn't know, she'd never heard of before, a guy called Jacques Derrida. And she was so taken by this book that she translated it and added this really long translator's preface to the book. And this actually became instantly popular and is still used as an introduction to Derrida's thought today. Now, coming forward in time a bit, in 2007 she became university professor at Columbia University, making her the first woman of color to achieve that highest faculty rank in the university's 264-year history. She's also received a number of honorary degrees from universities all over the world, such as University of Toronto, University of London, Oberlin College, the Universitat Rovira Virgili, the Rabindra Bharati University, Universidad Nacional de San Martin, University of St Andrews. There's many more. Anyway, she's got lots of honorary degrees. In 2012, she actually became the only Indian to ever receive the Kyoto Prize in Arts and Philosophy, and this is, considered to be kind of the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in this area. More recently, she translated A Season in the Congo by Amy Césaire, who was the teacher and the mentor of Frantz Fanon, who, of course, we looked at last week. Now, Spivak is perhaps a kind of a difficult person to place. So she's been described as a feminist, Marxist deconstructionist, and these are certainly aspects of her work, important aspects of her work. But it's perhaps not right to consider her a feminist, Marxist deconstructionist as if this were some kind of coherent, singular kind of thing, because there are massive tensions between these views. And Spivak, while certainly considering all three as important, isn't actually particularly interested in smoothing out the tensions between these three approaches. So for her, it's actually the discontinuities between these different approaches that she thinks are worth preserving. So we shouldn't paper over them. We shouldn't try to reconcile these approaches completely in her view. And the reason she thinks this is that reconciling these three approaches into one single discourse, one single theory, would, she thinks, be totalizing. So be offering a view of the world that's maybe too complete. Now, because of this, we probably shouldn't see Spivak as a kind of a systematic theorist. So she's not trying to develop some overarching philosophical or theoretical system like a lot of the theorists that we've looked at in this course. And one example of this is, you find with systematic philosophers that they try to explain how what they've said at one time or in one place is consistent with what they've said at another time in another place. So they try to explain how these different statements, these different ideas that they've developed fit into one overall philosophical system. Spivak, she's not so interested in doing this. So for her, when someone points out that something she said at one time doesn't necessarily fit with something she said at a different time, her response is basically, okay, that's fine, thanks for letting me know. So, make of that what you will. This could be seen as a positive thing or a negative thing, depending on your point of view. But in practice, it means that while the concepts and the ideas that I discuss in this lecture are going to all relate in some way, they're not going to be quite as tightly connected as in the case of some of the other theorists that we've looked at. So in this way, I'll be offering more like a list of ideas rather than kind of an overall systematic take on Spivak's philosophy, because of course she readily admits that such a thing doesn't exist, and she doesn't in fact desire such a thing to exist. So the first thing I want to think about then in the context of Spivak's thought is her use of deconstruction. So Spivak, like Derrida, thinks that European language puts forward a particular way of thinking about and of relating to the world. So Derrida, as I'm sure you recall, he focuses on the way that Western language is logocentric, so the way that it privileges presence over absence. Spivak, by contrast, is interested in the way that Western language acts to represent the world as a stable object of Western knowledge. So we talked about this a bit in the context of the Phenom material. This idea that the world is an object of Western thought. It's this thing that exists out there for Europeans to study and to theorize about. Now, it takes Western philosophy too, right? Western theorizing, this view, to be a neutral activity that just seeks to understand the world and nothing more. And Spivak rejects this assumption. Instead, Western thought, Western philosophy, Western science, Western IR theory is intimately tied up with Western imperial expansion. And this includes, European colonialism in the 19th century, as well as modern day US imperialism, for example. So she claims that deconstruction can help us to see the way that knowledge, right, again, philosophy, science, theory, so on, is merely kind of a naturalized form of personal history. So in other words, European experience, European lived experience, just gets turned into general truth. It's put across as general truth. So we take European philosophy, European theory, European science to be this kind of universal thing. But in actual fact, it's nothing more than European history and European desires kind of expanded out into universal status, treated as if they're more important than they are. So for Spivak, dismantling European language through deconstruction means she suggests at least that we can dismantle, while not perhaps colonialism and neo-colonialism itself, at least some of the self-serving justifications that support these activities. So in other words, we can come to see the way that our own desires and our own histories have been taken to be these universal ideas, these universal ideals, these universal truths, and the way that these ideas, these ideals, and these truths have underwritten colonialism and neo-colonialism as well. So Spivak, she wants to dismantle texts, she wants to dismantle textuality, the use of language in written works, in order to dismantle at the same time the rhetorical structures that justify imperial expansion of various kinds. And this is perhaps, we want to say, the contribution that literature can make to global politics. So, she comes from a comparative literature background. So, if literature underwrites imperialism and helps to justify imperialism, then the study of literature, particularly from this deconstructionist point of view, can potentially have real impacts on the world, can be a really political kind of activity. Now, one of the key ideas in Spivak's form of deconstruction is the observation, and this is something again that I mentioned in the Fanon lecture, that the world for Europe was uninscribed, right? And this was a key presumption of European thought in the colonial era, and really it's something that continues today, albeit perhaps in more subtle forms. I mean, as an example, it was literally the case that colonized land was declared blank, right? It was declared uninscribed. It was marked on the map as blank and open and ownerless. So we have, for example, the concept of terra nullius, right, or nobody's land. So Australian Aborigines inhabited Australia for 50,000 years, like 50,000 years before Europeans arrived. But Australia for Europeans was terra nullius. It was blank land that could be inscribed, literally inscribed on a map, according to the desires of European colonists. So, Australian Aborigines may as well not have existed. And before you think that we were so great in New Zealand, in 1940, Lieutenant William Hobson, following the instructions that had been given by the British government, pronounced the entirety of the South Island uninhabited by civilized peoples, and therefore terra nullius. So it's blank, open to be inscribed along European lines. And of course, a very similar thing occurred in Africa and in the Middle East. This land was seen to be open to inscription, leading to borders being drawn across the continents purely according to what Europe deemed useful to itself. So in other words, all of the world outside Europe was thought of as this kind of blank space on a map, able to be drawn in by Europe as it sees fit. And, and this is something we sort of touched on a bit with Schmidt as well, I'm sure you'll recall. And we see the similar kind of thing with modern-day neocolonialism. So the basic idea of neocolonialism is that core states are able to set up an economic and a political system globally to tie other states to them in ways that are beneficial to the core states. So it continues the same kind of activities, stripping states of their natural resources, turning the citizens of these states into cheap labor who work for the interests of the core states. And just think about, for example, the farmers who grow the coffee that I'm drinking right now, or the workers who are making the clothes that you wear, along with all of the raw materials that go into all of the things that consume your smartphones and so on. This is no surprise to you, I'm sure, but it's something worth noting. But what makes neocolonialism different to colonialism is that it takes place without direct political control of the territory being exploited. So the relationships between the colonized and the colonizer are functionally identical. It's really sort of a case of meet the new boss, same as the old boss. But in the modern era, the political control of these territories is no longer necessary to sustain the very same relationships of exploitation. So that's why it's neo-colonialism rather than just old-fashioned old-fashioned colonialism. And I think we can we can see in the attitudes of I think we can see the attitudes of colonialism, both including sort of American colonialism and old-fashioned European colonialism, persist into this new neo-colonial structure, right? So this idea that the rest of the world is uninscribed, An example of this, perhaps, think how obvious it is in the United States or in Europe that these states are able, through organizations such as the International Monetary Fund and tools such as the structural adjustment programs, that they should be able to dictate to developing states in such a way as to essentially completely determine the internal affairs of those states according to their own interests. This is only possible if these states are uninscribed. So in the way that the South Island didn't have any civilized peoples living there, states outside of globalization are in a similar state of barbarity, right? So they need to be brought in, they need to be kind of inscribed into the global order according to Western desires. So they can be made then part of the mapping of the West in terms of global production chains and so on. Now this is slightly, maybe very slightly, a less literal sense of the word inscription compared to the colonial period, which was literally a matter of drawing lines on a map, but it's the same kind of thinking. Now, perhaps another piece of this picture, and again something I touched on in the context of Fanon, is the presumed objectivity and rationality of Western philosophy and particularly relevant to us in this class of international relations theory. And this observation, or Spivak's observation about this, of course, undermines the focus of traditional IR on borders and on territoriality. Because traditional IR, it provides a particular narrative about the world in which the world is made up of states, right? And states are in this way seen as this really central, really obvious, really natural thing. And then the theory attempts merely to describe the world according to these particular, this particular universal narrative. But if we change our focus, right, instead look at not what European theory has inscribed on the world, but on what this narrative has left out, then the focus shifts to what is outside the border. It shifts to what's not included in the narrative, what it overlooks in its presumption to universality and totality. Now, another really important aspect of Spivak's thought, perhaps the most important, is the problem of representation. For Spivak, there are really serious ethical concerns when it comes to the question of, and political concerns as well, actually, when it comes to the question of who represents whom and how. So in particular, she identifies Foucault and Deleuze as two theorists who kind of engage in a problematic form of representation. So Foucault and Deleuze in their work, they're really genuinely, authentically concerned with speaking on behalf of the disenfranchised, speaking on behalf of the powerless, of the subaltern. But Spivak thinks we ought to be cautious about the appropriateness of radical intellectuals, like Foucault and Deleuze, people who obviously in reality are pretty comfortable, they're in high status social positions, speaking on behalf of disadvantaged groups. So instead she thinks we should focus on how we can ensure that disadvantaged groups can make their own voices heard. But of course things are not quite as simple as just letting people from disadvantaged groups speak, right? Because there's also the question of who represents those groups themselves. So what members of those groups are able to speak for themselves and are able to speak for the group. And one problematic kind of speaking for that Spivak identifies is something she calls the native informant. And this is a term that she borrows from the field of ethnography. So conventionally the term is used to refer to indigenous people who provide information about their society to ethnographers, right? So the ethnographer, they go to a place and they want to write about the customs and the society and so on. But they realize, of course, observing can only take you so far. Better is actually asking someone, asking this native informant, to explain all of these different things to the ethnographer. Now, of course, it's almost not worth stating here that the ethnographer we're talking about is almost certainly Western, and the society that's being looked at here is non-Western. So we've got a situation here where the Western ethnographer studies a non-Western society with the help of the native informant as the source of information. Now, Spivak thinks that while there are problems with the native informant in this context, one thing you can say is at least the native informant is being taken seriously, right? The native informant kind of has an identity. Now, it's an identity, obviously, that's inscribed by the West and is only inscribed by the West, but it is an identity, it's a cultural identity nonetheless. Now, of course, though, she points out that in this context, the native informant is also an other. So this native informant is treated merely as a source of information, as a passive object of knowledge. So she doesn't actually get to speak for her community because she's only related to as an other, right, as an object to be observed and to be incorporated into the Western ethnography. The native informant then is needed, right, because she provides information to the ethnographer, but at the same time, she is never able to obtain the position of subject or of narrator, right? So for this reason, Spivak calls the native informant a blank who is enlisted to inscribe native culture. Now, more problematic even than this is the use of the native informant in kind of a slightly different way. So not for ethnography, but actually for philosophy, or in this course for international relations theory. So Spivak suggests that the native informant actually plays a role in the context of what she terms the imperialist project of soul-making. And what this means is that imperialism constitutes a particular kind of European subject who's civilized and who is free. But, she thinks, this subject is always constituted at the expense of the native informant. So Western philosophy, or Western theory, explicitly or implicitly contrasts its form of knowledge, or this Western subjectivity, with the knowledge or the subjectivity of the native informant. So instead of being free and civilized, right, the native informant is constituted as uncivilized and as bound, right? Particular as opposed to universal. So when Western philosophy, and Spivak here identifies Kant particularly, talks about this free, rational nature of human beings, this is something that's implicitly contrasted with this bound, irrational nature of the inhuman natives. So this whole project of Western philosophy, she thinks, based around a certain kind of subject, this free, rational subject, is therefore constituted in opposition to the non-human nature of the native. So the native informant then, Spivak thinks at least, is this constant presence in Western thought, albeit a masked kind of presence. And the same is true for IR. So, traditional IR, of course, operates with a similar kind of model, right? It talks about anarchy, it talks about power, it talks about freedom. States can, after all, they can do anything they want in the international system, so long as they have the power to do so. And if we go back to Hobbes, again, I'm sure you recall, in the state of nature, we all have this absolute right to do whatever we want, to take what we want, to kill who we want. So in the state of nature, we're absolutely free. And this is the basic model underlying realism, right? A model that absolutely relies, or at least Spivak suggests it does, on this model of human subjectivity that's constituted against the colonial subject. So Western philosophy, including IR theory, constitutes both the universal human subject and at the same time kind of the non-human particular native object. So they're part of the same package. They always go together. So Spivak, she's really interested in, as I'm sure it's pretty apparent by now, the experiences of individuals and social groups who've been historically dispossessed and exploited by European colonialism. And one of the forms that this dispossession and exploitation has taken, perhaps one of the tools that has been used to accomplish these aims, is the application of Derrida's concept of catachresis. Now, this isn't it's not a term we discussed in the context of Derrida. It's a new term, so don't worry that you're just hearing it now. The basic idea is a catachresis is the way in which universal categories have been used to represent groups that are actually internally divided. So, for example, if we talk about women, even though there are these quite huge, quite fundamental divisions among people in that category, for example, there are women in positions of power and women who are not in positions of power. This is a catachresis, right? So even though we might say, all right, women are oppressed by men, when we pay attention to the internal divisions within this group, well, it's clear that while that may be true in some kind of general sense, actually things aren't quite so simple in practice. You could talk about workers in this way, right? So there's clearly a difference between a casualized worker in the sharing economy and a securely employed manager somewhere, right? Or between a worker in New Zealand or in the United States and a worker in Mozambique or something, right? And the term worker, used by Marxist theorists, papers over these internal divisions. And the same is true when it comes to the colonized, right? So different places have been colonized in different ways. Different European powers, for example, had different methods of colonial rule. And within colonial countries, different people are differently situated, right? So the term colonized is always also going to be a catachresis. It's always going to be this improper use of a word through treating as a universal category a group of people who are actually internally divided in some pretty important ways. Now, the reading mentions Africa in this context. So Africa, Spivak thinks, is also a catachresis. It's a word that draws together a bunch of quite disparate things and imposes this categorization on these things. Now, of course, it's Europe who did this, right? It was Europe who labeled Africa in such a way as it became intertwined with race-based ideas. We could think about the term Native American or American Indian in this way, because there are incredibly diverse range of cultures in North America. There are 296 indigenous languages from 29 different language families. It's quite a lot. But the term Indian groups all of these disparate cultures together, but importantly, does so within a European imaginary that's tied up with colonial ideas of the savage native, right? So this is not saying necessarily that these groups can't internally, have a shared identity. So all different, different cultures in North America might identify as First Nations peoples, and they might have a shared identity there. But in that case, that's an identity that stems from their own solidarity, and that doesn't stem from an imposition of a category onto the group from the outside. Now, of course, the same kind of thing is true with Australia. There are up to 27 language families spoken by Aboriginal Australians. So the term Aboriginal as well is quite clearly a catachresis. It's this master word that's used to situate this diversity of groups into a dominant colonial framework of thought. Now, clearly relevant to international politics and the discipline of IR as well are the terms third world or developing world. Now, the third world is a term that's not quite so relevant now. It's still used oddly, but it's not It's not as common now as it was. So originally it was used to refer to countries that weren't part of the American democratic bloc, so Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and Japan, and so on, so the first world, but were also not part of the Soviet bloc, China, Cuba, Vietnam, etc., who were the second world. So all the other countries, the unaligned countries, were the third world. Now, of course, we use it somewhat still these days, but of course the meaning has shifted to be more or less synonymous with developing country. Now, I think it's fairly clear how this term operates as a catachresis. Right? We have a framework in which the dominant picture is a bipolar picture. And so even though there's this massive diversity among the third world, right, among these non-allied nations, they're kind of just all grouped together. Now, who does this? Well, it's not the third world who developed this framework. It's the US and the Soviets who developed it. And what's the result? Well, the third world ends up being racially coded in what's more or less a neo-colonial system. It's made part of an imaginary in which we have two great blocs, these two equals, who can't directly intervene in each other's affairs, and then we have this sort of fundamentally racialized rest, who are kind of in the place of the savage native, who are completely open to what the two major blocs decide to do with them. And so this is, to a fairly significant extent, this is a racial ordering, though it's not one that traditional IR theories like realism and liberalism are very comfortable discussing. In the term the developing world, same kind of idea, and in fact the developing world may be even more clearly part of a neo-colonial racial ordering of the world than the third world. So developing world is clearly associated with non-Europeans, and of course it brings together all these extremely disparate groups, but it does so in such a way that the differences between them are kind of more or less overlooked. And most importantly, it fits these societies into this imaginary of globalized neo-colonial capitalism. So, developing world may even be kind of a catachresis or a neo-colonial catachresis kind of par excellence. Now, of course, neoliberalism, the IR theory, not the economic doctrine, it's just not able to see how this catachresis operates. Right? It can't situate it in the context of neocolonialism, and it can't discuss the racial dimension of this term. It can't talk about the way that the primarily European developed world operates in tandem with the developing world in the same way that Western philosophy constitutes and is constituted by the native informant. Right? It doesn't have the resources to think about how this term operates as part of a neo-colonial project of soul-making. Now, of course, it's worth mentioning here that the developed world is not exclusively European. So Japan, notably, is part of the developed world. Singapore, Korea, Hong Kong, all part of the developed world. But I think implicitly or explicitly, these countries are usually kind of spoken about as being honorary Europeans. Right? It might even be interesting to consider, I think, in this context, that this is kind of an idle thought, the parallels between the idea of model minorities and this idea of honorary European states. Right? So model minorities, they're ethnic groups in Western countries, typically Asian, who are seen to be successful minorities. Right? They fit in, they behave themselves, they don't cause problems. And so they become honorary Europeans. Right? And I think this is kind of similar to the model, perhaps the model non-European state. Right? Of which Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea are maybe the best examples. But regardless of the validity of that observation, the basic model is nevertheless Eurocentric. Right? And one of Spivak's aims is to show how Eurocentrism is kind of the prerequisite for how we construct a vision of the other. Now, I think a particularly pertinent example of this kind of Eurocentrism and the racism underlying traditional IR scholarship is the concept of rogue states. Right? Rogue states are, of course, located pretty much or definitely entirely in the third world or in the developing world. The United States, for example, despite really doing what it wants to do pretty much all of the time, can never really be considered a rogue state. I mean, people kind of sometimes call it a rogue state, but something about the term just doesn't fit. Furthermore, it's typically orthodox Anglo-American IR theorists who have developed and applied this concept of rogue states. So rogue states, according to traditional IR theorists, they're a threat to a stable and orderly world. But of course, being grouped together in this way, the term rogue states ends up acting as a catachresis. It overlooks the quite specific colonial histories of these places and the way that colonialism has actually led to the situations that we face today. And of course, it also merely assumes that the global order, right, an order of which Europe and the US is the center, is a natural and obvious order, right? And the rejection of this order is put across as if it stems from the ignorance of the native, right? That they just don't get that the European order is this universal, obvious one because they're stuck in such a low stage of civilization, right? In other words, because they're primitive. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is Spivak's discussion of the subaltern woman. And this is the main focus of what was the secondary reading, but I decided it was too long, so I've switched it out. Now it's a supplementary reading of Spivak's, which is called Can the Subaltern Speak? And this is far and away her most famous work. So a large part of Spivak's criticism in this article is of Western First World feminists. So we might consider as well, I think, the term feminist in this context as a catachresis as well. So woman or feminist is not this universal category. Right? There's a huge amount of diversity within this group, and there are relations of domination within this group as well. So Spivak points out then that the constitution of the female subject in the West differs from the third world or the developing world woman. And one result of this is that the Western feminist tends to make universal claims about justice and about fairness and about right and wrong. And developing world feminists take these claims, I think quite understandably, as an instance of the developed world speaking for the developing world, right? Or to put it another way, yet another instance of the colonists speaking for the colonized. And this speaking for is not something that just happens at the level of speech. It also has real material effects on the world. And the fact is, for instance, that the global economy is structured along both gendered lines and racial lines simultaneously. So talking about a universal subject of feminism may do something to draw attention to the gendered nature of the global economy in certain ways, but in doing so it ignores the racial dimension. And there's also an undoubted global division of labor between developed and developing countries. This is part and parcel, of course, of neocolonialism, of what it is. And women's exploitation within this system is of particular note. So developing world women are not just exploited racially in neocolonialism, but they're also exploited on the basis of gender within this system. And one way that the system does this is by situating developing world women as doubly subaltern. Right? So they're not just objects of colonial thought on the basis of race, but they're also living within a system that at the same time keeps men dominant. Right? So they're objects on the basis of both race and on the basis of gender. And Spivak really wants to draw attention to this double objectification. Right? So if the subaltern in colonialism can't speak, if they're always being spoken for, then the developing world women are doubly subaltern in this way, right, in this system. They're spoken for as both the colonized, right, so along racial lines, as well as being spoken for as women. So they're even more in the shadow. And one example of this in practice that the reading draws attention to is the casualized labor of women in the global south. So huge numbers of women in the global south actually work way more than men. To a pretty significant degree, the global system of production is actually borne on the backs of developing world women. But they don't have the same access to secure work, right? Their work is always flexible or it's informal, even though it's, in practical terms, they do more of it. And this is, of course, not counting at all the caring work that is also done by these developing world women. So we have a situation in which women in the developing world are exploited in two different ways. They're exploited as colonized or neo-colonized people, and they're exploited as women. So either way, they're spoken for. So as women, they're spoken for by Western feminists, and as colonized people, they're spoken for by developing world men. So in her article, Can the Subaltern Speak?, Spivak takes as a central example of this kind of double objectification, of this double speaking for sati, or widow burning, in India during the colonial period. So she points out that the British colonists, rather than actually supporting Indian women to find and express their own voice, instead used Indian women as an ideological battleground for colonial power. Right? So the opposition to sati, because the British banned sati, so the opposition to women dying on the funeral pyres of their dead husbands had very little to do with actual concern for the women themselves. Rather, sati was used as an example of the extent to which India needed civilizing by Europe. And therefore, it operated as a way of justifying European British exploitation of India and of Indians. Right? Put it in these terms, it wasn't a colonial or an instance of colonial exploitation. No, it was a civilizing mission. Britain was doing India a favor. So Britain spoke for Indian women by declaring sati as uncivilized, but really they were using sati, using Indian women as a justification for colonialism. So it was a case of white men saving brown women from brown men. On the other side of this, though, we have the traditional patriarchal authority in India. So Hindu patriarchal authority in India argued for women's right to choose sati. But of course, they were actually doing no such thing, right? In this case, the patriarchal authority, they weren't interested in representing Indian women. They were using Indian women themselves as a way of reinforcing their own authority, right? So they were using Indian women as a way of carving out their own sphere of authority within, British colonialism by arguing that Britain should leave the traditional practices of Indians alone. In other words, by arguing that they should be left alone to, that the Hindu authority should be left alone to do what it wanted. So on either side, Indian women were being spoken for, right? They weren't given the opportunity to speak for themselves. Now, another example of this is the issue of headscarves, right? Now, I'm going to play you a brief clip now, an excerpt from an interview with Spivak, in which she discusses this very topic.
با سلام مجدد. یکی از مسائلی رو که جنبش سبز بهاش مواجه هست اینه که چطور ممکنه وقتی یک ملتی برای آزادی‌های مدنیش در حال مبارزه هست، زبان و گویش این مبارزه رو گویش جهانی شده نیولیبرالیسم جهانی در گفتمان خودش هضم نکنه و مصادره نکنه. میهمان امروز ما خانم گایاتری چاکرابورتی اسپیوک، یکی از برجسته‌ترین فلاسفه و نظریه پردازان معاصر دنیاست. Thanks, Gayatri, for joining us. Gayatri, the question that we have is, how can we talk about human rights, civil rights, women's rights in the context of what in Iran we call the Green Movement, without the language of rights being assimilated in the language of the hegemonic language of neoliberalism?
Hamid, that's the struggle. In other words, we cannot give up this language. And I'll tell you this, that among young radical people in India, people that I know, there's a hope that in fact this example, what's happening in Iran, will help them as well. It is the struggle to wrench that discourse, to win that discourse back from this kind of moral political high ground, from that appropriation.
The obvious question that comes after that is, what about specifically women's rights? How can we talk about women's rights in this context without the language of women's rights being appropriated in the neoliberal context?
Iranian women really don't need to hear from me how to, because we really look forward to what they do in terms of writing what is specifically Iranian from Persian history into women's rights. I mean, I've heard this in public here and there. But it seems to me the real problem with women's rights within general civil rights movements, including this one, is for the women not to forget. Not to forget that that is always in the forefront. It is not something that comes later. It is not ancillary. And then after that, the notion that the emancipation of women or the liberation of women, which is that Eurocentric discourse, even military intervention takes it over, that I think that way of thinking has to be profoundly changed. And I don't think the Iranian women really are lacking in this perception, but I will say it anyway. I mean, what we are really thinking about is making women's strength visible and doing this together, rather than freeing them from something essentially traditional and bad. So we are really talking about women's counter-modernity, rather than just kind of free them from bad Islam.
All right, so I think we can see the same kind of dynamics at play here, right? We've got, on the one hand, Western feminists using these universal ideals to save brown women from brown men without actually listening to anything these women have to say. On the other hand, you have traditional, Iranian patriarchal authority using Iranian women as a means of reinforcing their own authority. Again, without listening to the women themselves. So Spivak, she wants to deconstruct this dichotomy, this colonizer and colonized, this universal feminist and traditional patriarchal authority, which kind of structures the way we think about this. So instead, she wants to challenge us to open up a space to speak to, rather than for, the gendered subaltern, right? Space not just of listening, right? Because listening can make subaltern women nothing more than a native informant in potential, but actually of talking. Okay, so next on Thursday we'll be looking at Edward Said, again continuing post-colonialism. He is in fact another comparative literature person, same university as Spivak.